welcome to PowerSpeaking Live. I'm Carrie Beckstrom, your host of this monthly series and the CEO of PowerSpeaking Incorporated. Today's live discussion is going to be focused on providing a wealth of advice on how to prepare for and nail a job interview. And to help put the importance of this topic in perspective, I'd like to lead off with just a few stats. Online job postings receive, on average, 250 applicants. And employers, on average, interview fewer than 10 candidates for any given job. So that means that only 2 to 3% of job applicants, on average, are invited for an interview. So the bottom line is that these are pretty tough to secure. So when you succeed in getting one, you want to be prepared to seize the opportunity and sell your value in the best possible way. And we have two expert panelists with us today who are prepared to share all sorts of advice on how to do just that. First off, I'd like to introduce Pamela Skillings. Pamela is the chief coach and co-founder of Big Interview, which is a job interviewing training system that has helped millions to ace their interviews and land big jobs. And if your fingers aren't poised at the keyboard, ready to take notes, or you don't have a pen and paper at the ready, I suggest you do, because Pamela is one of the leading experts in this field, and we are so fortunate to have you with us today, Pamela.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here.
And I'm delighted that we're on the same side of the United States today. You're from Chicago, right?
I'm based in New York, but I'm here on
New York.
the lovely
That's
West
right.
Coast today on Pacific time.
Yeah, right in beautiful Monterey. So thank you so much for being here with us. We also have Rita Williams. Rita is one of PowerSpeaking's master facilitators and coaches. Rita is also the owner and primary coach for RDC Solutions, where, among other things, she has helped countless people secure jobs through her very personalized one-on-one coaching services. And this includes those just starting out in their career, as well as very seasoned professionals looking to make a career change. So I suggest you have your pen and paper at the ready also, because Rita has all sorts of wisdom that she's prepared to share with you. Thank you so much for joining us today, Rita.
Happy to be here, Terry.
Terrific. And I should have mentioned at the outset that following today's episode, this episode, as well as all past ones, will be available on the PowerSpeaking podcast. And we'll include a link to that podcast for you in chat so that you can grab that and have it for easy access later on. And before we dive in, I'd love to learn a little bit more about all of you in our audience. First off, and we're going to put up a few poll questions to glean some insights. First off, please share with us where you are in your career journey. Are you just starting out, somewhere in the middle, or more on the later end? So we'll give you a few minutes to respond to that poll. Okay, so the majority of you are mid-career. We've got a few folks who are just starting out and some who are more on the tail end. So love the diversity. The next thing that would be helpful for us to understand, providing you're seeking a new job, what is motivating you to do that? Are you just transitioning from college? Have you recently been laid off? What scenario that we have listed here best applies to you? Okay, terrific. Thank you. So again, we've got a variety. We don't have anyone re-entering the workforce, but some who have been laid off, some who are looking to make a change, seeking advancement, a few transitioning from college. So That'll be helpful to keep in mind, Pamela and Rita, as we respond to the various questions. Thank you so much for sharing your input. The other thing that I want to stress is that uh, please don't hesitate to put any questions that you may have in chat. We want to make this as interactive as possible, and we'll pause periodically to address your questions. If you have feedback or your own advice you'd like to share from your own experience, feel free to do that as well. So, Pamela, I think you have been doing this work, I think you mentioned for 20 years now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Fun flies when you're having fun.
Yeah. So I'd be interested in understanding to what degree things have changed over the years. How has the job interviewing process changed, and what are you finding to be most relevant and different in today's environment?
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest changes are all a result of technology. So there's the fact that technology has made it possible to do video-based interviews. So whether they're live videos on Zoom or Teams or another platform, or now this new trend of these asynchronous video interviews where you record an answer, you're not talking to anyone except the screen, and you record an answer and submit it. So the technology has changed the different formats that are most common for conducting interviews. And that, we can talk some more about that later, but that raises both challenges and opportunities. And I think it also helped spur another change, which is the move toward remote work and the opportunity for employers to hire people from anywhere in the world because they can do them remotely, they can manage them remotely. And so that does make things more competitive in some industries because you can choose from anyone all over the world to fill a position, which maybe was more difficult in the past. And I think also with remote positions, that has raised some changes in terms of the skills and competency areas that we look for, people who can manage themselves, to take initiative, and time management, other things that are so important when you're working remotely. So I think a lot of the questions that are asked tend to be similar. It's funny, a lot of the questions that were sort of the classic interview questions of the past are still asked pretty often. We've had some new ones joining because there's a lot more questions about technical skills. These behavioral questions, which I know we're going to talk more about later, have become more common and a bigger factor in choosing who to hire. And questions about diversity and other issues that have become more and more important to employers over the years. So I guess that's a summary of the biggest changes that I've seen.
Oh, thank you. And that all really makes sense. And I just want to underscore the point you made about uh, remote work and or hybrid work being so much more prevalent, which also means in some cases it's even more competitive. Additionally, though, the importance of being proactive if you're interviewing for a position to highlight those skills that are really essential to effectively work in a remote environment. That's a great point. And knowing your technology and being prepared to show up effectively if you're interviewing virtually as opposed to in person.
Carrie, I just want to add on to that I agree with Pamela on so much that has changed with the technology available. But in some industries, it hasn't changed as much as others. Like, for example, I work with a lot of folks in the real estate industry, which is a pretty traditional industry, and it's a pretty in-person industry. So the networking aspect is still as important as it was 10, 15, 20 years ago. Versus in technology, that yes, the technology is available to them, but you better be networking too.
Great point. Great point. So it also really varies depending on the industry that you're in or want to be a part of. That's a great point. So
things may be shifting again because some companies are trying people back to work in person. So we might see some shifts back in that direction too.
Yeah. Yeah. So being adaptable and flexible is more important than ever. That always applies.
Absolutely.
So Rita, would you share with us, based on your experience, some of the most common mistakes applicants make in the interviewing process and what we should be looking to avoid?
Sure. Well, if we all had the same rule book, the interviewers and the interviewees, life would be a lot easier. But I think the mistakes people make fall into the before the interview, during, and after. So I'll start with before the interview, which might not even happen if you make these mistakes. Real simple, seemingly obvious, but it happens all the time, is a mistake on your resume, like a typo. And just a grammatical mistake or a typo could just sift you out of the pile right there. So if there's one document you want to be sure it's 100% accurate, it's your resume. And that goes for any cover letter or communication in advance also. Also before, making sure that your references are vetted. You don't know how fast they're going to get to the references if they know somebody, but know that they're on your list so that if they get a call, it doesn't come as a surprise. During the interview, there's so many, it depends if it's virtual, if it's live, but I tend to go to live because I'm coaching people for that a lot. Being dressed appropriately, not too casual. If you're not sure, find out. Dress better than they will. You're never going to get in trouble or get judged because you're dressed nicely. So I think dress, be on time, be early. Don't be chewing gum. The simple, clear that out. But then during the interview, mistakes people make is not being prepared to sell themselves. As you said, Carrie, like I was in sales for 15 years, so I'm used to selling. People not in sales roles are more uncomfortable selling, but you are selling yourself. So being prepared to fit yourself in and have that narrative ready to go, having practiced it out loud. So you're not asking the interviewer to do a ton of work, but don't assume that they have read your resume soup to nuts and that they come prepared with all the questions to extract the most important information. Be prepared to share it readily. And afterwards, I think the biggest mistake people make is not following up, not having an agreed upon next step. It's something that I expect. And if I don't hear from somebody, I'm not thinking they're interested. So don't assume they're going to follow up with you. Make a plan to follow up with them. Those are the biggest mistakes, right? Yeah, those are the biggest mistakes I've seen, heard of, and coach people not to make.
Great. Pamela, it looked like you had something to add.
Yeah, I'm like eager to jump on one of the points that Rita made about, I think I would agree, one of the biggest mistakes that I see is just not preparing enough. As Rita said, this idea of selling yourself is foreign to a lot of people, or at least not comfortable in an interview interaction, because people, even if you're a great communicator, very accomplished, you're probably not used to having to talk about that with a stranger while you're being judged, So I feel like an interview is sort of a different communication format than most of us do at all in the rest of our life. So I think preparing, being aware of that, thinking about how to answer the questions. And the good news is that a lot of the questions are pretty predictable. So you can think about it and sort of outline your answers so that you can answer in a concise way that also covers all the things you want them to know and conveys confidence. And especially if you've got any situations you need to explain, if you have a gap, or if you left a role abruptly, or if you're making a switch and you need to sort of sell your transferable skills, things that are a little bit more challenging to communicate call for even more preparation. And I can talk more about this later, but I'm also a big believer in practice, especially if you're someone who gets nervous and feels awkward in interviews, just doing it out loud. And on Big Interview, that's basically why I created Big Interview initially, was to create a platform so that my clients could go in and practice in a way that wasn't weird, where they had to recruit their friend or talk to the dog or the mirror or whatever, but to create a way to just sort of practice without anyone judging them and kind of get used to talking about themselves in this way. So if you have to talk to the dog or the mirror, that's better, in my opinion, than not doing it. I think a little bit of practice really just helps you, feel much more confident on interview day, and also sound much more refined and polished.
Wonderful. I was completely listening to you, Pamela. I was also looking the conversation that we're getting in chat, and I want to address some of these. And this gets to David's point too. David Binder said, what should people focus on when they sell themselves? And also adding on to that, what advice do you have for people where that really is uncomfortable for them to do? And it's kind of a stretch to do that.
I'd say this is the number one thing I see with my clients when they, when I'm giving them feedback after our first practice interview, where sometimes they're aware of it themselves, which is I'm just not good at selling myself. I don't know what to do or how to do it. And so a lot of it comes down to, analyzing the job description before you go in and being really clear about what are my strengths and accomplishments that I should really highlight because they make me a great fit for this role. And then thinking about how do I incorporate those points into the question, into my answers to the question, especially, they're probably going to ask, tell me about yourself. They're probably going to ask, tell me about what you did in your most recent role. There are things that you're going to get. And if you think about, well, how do I make sure to cover these points? And if you don't feel, you don't have to be an extrovert or super, aggressive about it. You can do it in your own voice, and that's where practice can help a little bit. You can be factual. You don't have to go in and say, I'm the project manager who ever lived. You must hire me now. You can go in and say, I've managed for 10 years, I've managed large scale technology projects, managing teams of over 25 people. I've been promoted, using the facts. And then another little trick that I give people is you can also quote other people. So you can say, my manager's feedback was this, the client told me it was the greatest, outcome they'd had. There are ways to sell yourself without sounding like you're bragging. Although I would stress that an interview is a place where you do have to brag a little bit to be elected. You don't have to be obnoxious about it, but I would say try not to be too hung up on not bragging at all.
Yeah. Yeah. So in other words, really, really strive to convey that confidence in your own capabilities and your confidence that you know that you can add significant value to this position for these specific reasons. I have so many thoughts flowing through my mind. It just so happens that I personally have interviewed a lot this year. So this is all fresh in my mind. And just one little tip I want to share that I'll credit someone on our team for doing this. And it was one of the many things that caused his resume to stand out above all others is for each of the positions he had listed on his resume, he had an actual quote from someone that he worked with that kind of captured the essence of his value. And that was such a small but significant thing from my perspective and can easily be fact-checked. And to your point, Pamela, that's a nice way to balance you personally talking about your value while having, others validate that. So if you're on the call, kudos to you for standing out in that regard. And to your point, Rita, I could not believe it. We're a communications company. If you can't demonstrate that you're an exceptional communicator, you're not even going to be considered. I could not believe the number of resumes that had grammatical or typos in them. Could not believe it. So, and the other thing I'll add to your point, Rita, it was the minority of candidates that we interviewed who followed up with a thank you or a video thank you. So take that into account. That's such a simple way for you to stand out and rise above all of the others that you're competing against. So we have Mary McGlynn. She also has interviewed a lot of people throughout her career. She says, I think another before the interview suggestion, do a heck of a lot of research on the company that you're interviewing for. And thank you, Mary. That's a perfect transition to our next topic. Rita, can you talk a little bit about your top tips as it relates to preparation and how you go about researching the company, how in depth you should go? What's your advice?
Well, how in depth, I think sometimes my first thought is commensurate with your interest. However, I do think that you should have a process so that it's not just the great interview that comes along that you're prepared for, that you have a process that you follow for each. And for some people, they might be one of 5 and they're going to need to go a lot deeper than if you're going to be one of 50 and it's an initial entry level, take a number. But As far as researching the company, I think you should do as much research as you can on the company. And some big companies are much easier to research than some smaller companies. If they're public, as we work with a lot with Salesforce, and you can not only do the research on the company, you could do the research on the person. If you're internal looking to make a move, they've got it all right there. It used to be a stretch, almost stalking, if you were doing all that research on a person, but now it's expected. If somebody comes to an interview with me and they don't know about me and my background, my success, what's important to me, which they can find online, I expect that. I would be disappointed if somebody hadn't done that research. So the company, the role, to the extent that you can, is it a common role? Is it a new role? What do people, what is the expectation of the role? Where are you going to go from there? So I want people to go in knowing as much as they can about the company, the person they're interviewing with, and the role. And I want them to have their narratives ready. How, we already discussed being able to sell yourself, and have also ready questions that I saw in chat, somebody saying, what smart questions? Those smart questions depend on what you couldn't find out. But if you demonstrate that you care and you've done your homework, there might be gaps in what you could find out. So if you say, I learned that this was important to the company, this is an area that I excel, I'd love to know how you fit into that. You might not be able to tell how that person is demonstrating their, whether it's connection to DEI or performance metrics or a new arena in the company. So I think demonstrating that you've done your homework earns you the right to ask some of those questions for the gaps you weren't able to fill.
Excellent, Rita. And as, again, someone doing a lot of interviewing myself, I fully respect that and welcome to engage in that type of conversation. Pamela, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Great answer. I would just add, just in terms of how, of course, the company website and Google and all of that, but also people probably know this, but LinkedIn is a great resource. Not only can you look up the person you're interviewing with, but you can also, a lot of companies are very active on LinkedIn, and they post about what they're doing. They share big wins. You can see who else works there. Maybe you know someone or know someone who worked there, which can give you a little bit of advantage. Maybe you can connect with someone that has a connection there. So LinkedIn can give you a lot of great information, and also allow you to continue, even if you don't get hired. Then the interview turns into a networking opportunity that maybe down the line could lead to something else. And I would also say Glassdoor can be a really helpful resource to research companies. Take it with a grain of salt, because as with anything, the people who post reviews tend to really love the company or really hate the company. So you have to use some critical thinking there, but you can learn a bit about what it's like to work there and what's the management like. There's not every company has a lot of reviews, but there's some good information there. And Glassdoor also has info on salary ranges and other things that can be helpful as you're preparing for the interview.
Excellent. Yeah. I think you brought up, Rita, doing it today versus decades ago. Oh my gosh, shame on you if you haven't come prepared, because there's just a wealth of information at your disposal online. And to that point, Mark Brumley asked, people will know when you look them up on LinkedIn, is that okay and expected?
Totally. Yeah. I mean, don't go on Facebook and look at their vacation photos, but LinkedIn, totally fine.
I would say it's more than okay and it's expected. Yeah. So going back, and we touched on some of this, but I want to delve in a little bit more. Kurt Kellogg. Kurt, welcome. I'm so thrilled you're joining us. He said the interview can be a two-way street. What smart questions would you expect or want applicants to ask the interviewer? What advice do you have on that?
I think Rita touched on that a little bit in terms of asking smart questions that show you've already done some research, and it's not just like, what is this company anyway, right? You want to show that you are interested and professional enough to have done some research. And I always feel, I mean, it's a balance act, right? Because part of this process is the learning things you need to know if you want to accept the offer when it comes. Earlier rounds, I think the questions that you ask, in addition to gathering information, I think more of the focus should be on showing them your interest, your enthusiasm, your where your values lie. So asking about what the company's working on, what the culture is like, what are some of the more interesting projects that the team's been working on this year? What do you think are some of the big goals we're going to hit next year? Really imagining yourself in the role and asking questions that show that engagement and not only working there, but excelling if they were to bring you in for that particular role.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. Just a piece of advice I have, and it varies somewhat depending on the level of role. But if you have the opportunity to interview with multiple leaders in the company, I think a very important question to ask is, what are their top priorities, and assess the degree to which there's alignment. Because if you get different feedback from different leaders, that's somewhat of a red flag that there's lack of alignment at the top, which can lead to some dysfunction. So I think it's just a good way to assess the strength of the alignment from a strategic standpoint.
And Carrie, on the question about what smart questions to ask, I think it varies. There's no one question that I would ask every interviewer, but if they want to know what's my 5-year, 10-year vision, I want to know what their 5-year, 10-year vision is. Is this a role that you expect somebody to be in 1 to 2 to 3 years, or is it a 3 to 5 or more? And where have the last people in this role gone, within the company or outside? Like, what are the pathways? I'm very interested to know what's the common pathway for this role? And especially if they're asking me, where do you see yourself in 5 years? I want to know where you would see somebody coming into this role in 5 years. And that might sound like a very long time for people in the workforce now. It used to be like, oh, I'll still be at this company. But I think thinking through the questions that are going to be relevant for the role that you're looking at that time, but not making it just a generic list that you ask everyone.
Wonderful. Yeah, excellent advice. Another thing that is so important to assess to determine whether or not a company and culture is going to be a good fit for you is to the degree to which the organization is truly committed to fostering a diverse, equitable, and inclusive work environment. What advice do you have for evaluating that? Because everyone promotes the fact that they're doing it, but the degree to which that commitment level is really there and sustained varies. Pamela?
Yeah, I think it's fine to ask directly about, if you do the research beforehand. Most companies will have something about their commitment to diversity. You'll notice some people just it looks like talking points that sound good, and in other cases they have more details that back things up. So if you go in and look at that information and ask follow-up questions, it accomplishes 2 things. It shows that you've done some research, and it shows that you're interested in that value. And I think most companies are at least attempting to make diversity and inclusion a core value and looking for people who feel the same way. So asking a question like, I noticed one of the core values is diversity and inclusion, and you have this program. Can you tell me more about it? Can you tell me more about the team and, different backgrounds on the team, or how diverse is the group? So those can be useful questions to ask if you want to ask directly. And of course, some things are subtle, and reading between the lines and getting a sense of how believable some of these answers are, and if they have information to back it up, or if it feels more like posturing, which I think is the case, unfortunately, sometimes.
And once again, if you have the opportunity to interview with different levels, like leadership, and then those that maybe are going to be your team members, asking those questions of multiple folks within the organization, I think can be very helpful. And then we have a very specific one here from Karina. Is 36 hours too long to send the thank you email with a significant follow-up?
No. Send it if you haven't sent it. I would aim, if possible, I would aim for 24 hours, but 36 is fine. Send it as soon as you can. And I think they won't be counting the hours if you send them a nice note with the information they want.
Well, 15 or more years ago, I was like, handwritten note by mail. But if you're interviewing with somebody virtually and they're at their house, they're not going to give you their home address. So it's going to be an email. It could be a phone call, but do it, whether it's 24 hours or 7 days later. I think it's absolutely mandatory to follow up. And even if you're not interested, you don't know who they're having dinner with. They might know somebody else. There might be a different role in the future. You don't want to be remembered for not following up.
Great point. Great point. We've got a great question here from Nissy. It's back on this topic of selling yourself, but a different twist. Do you have any suggestions for interviewing internally where you know the entire interview panel and need to sell yourself?
Yes, this is a great question because it is a bit different, right? It raises different challenges. On the one hand, you have an advantage because people know you and know your work. And if you're in the running for a promotion or a move, most likely they respect that, or at least most people do. So you have that going for you. You don't have to explain everything about you. I think one of the challenges that comes up sometimes is especially if you've been there a while, people tend to see you as the person in this role. They may not really know much about what you've done before or what you can do. So I think sometimes making an effort to prepare to make sure that you're conveying that and not assuming that they know everything about what you've accomplished and what your training and education and other advantages might be, so that you don't want to be seen as, oh, she's just an internal candidate. Let's go with someone from outside I've seen that happen. The internal candidate had the skills, but people saw them in a certain way versus the external candidate. So I think be careful to make sure that you're still selling your strengths. It might be a bit easier. You don't have to give all of the backstory as you might if you're new to the company.
But I want to piggyback on that, Pamela, because I think it's explore all the other areas that they don't know, whether it's volunteering, previous job. It could be work that you do at a school. It could have been something that you did in your educational path, but it's the opportunity to feature what they don't know.
Excellent. Excellent. The one other thing I'll add, depending on the dynamic within the organization, I used to work for a very, very, very large corporation, and there tended to be times in which the pendulum would shift where there would be a propensity to hire more from within, and then a consultant would come in and say, you don't have enough fresh perspective, you need to hire more from the outside. So, depending on the time, there would be more of a trend towards one way or the other. And if it happens to be an environment where you feel like there might be a preference to look externally, I think another important thing to bring up is the things that you do to continue to get external perspective, organizations that you're a part of, things that you're constantly reading, research that you tap into, network groups you're part of, to stress that you're still bringing that outside perspective and you haven't gotten too kind of myopic in your thinking.
And I want to add one other thing on the internal interview front. Sorry, it just occurred to me, but I think it's important. It's something I've seen people neglect is you really want to be able to communicate why you're interested in making this move to this other role and your commitment to that. And especially if it's a promotion or, it's a bit of a stretch or something different than what you've been doing. So just don't assume that they're going to know. Make sure that you're clear, like, I'm really excited about this role as the next step in my career, and here's why. Be prepared to answer that question.
Great. We've got another. I love the engagement with this group. From David Binder, I would be sure to focus on I did rather than we did in response to behavioral interviews. People tend, oh dear, it's jumping all over the place. People tend to default to we did in fear of not being seen as a team player, and you can credit the team and share your specific contributions. I am so grateful that you brought that up, David, because as someone who's trying to really assess this person's experience and direct involvement in doing certain things, if that broad we is constantly used, it's very difficult to really know to what extent did this person have a peripheral role or directly build that. So it sounded like that resonated with you, Pamela.
100%. I talk to people about this all the time. I mean, that balance, because of course, it's the we situation, but you want to make clear what your individual role was, especially if it was impressive, especially if you came up with the idea or led the team or, saved the day in some way. And I think this is a difficult shift for people, because when you're talking about your accomplishments internally, of course, especially if you're a leader, it's all about we did this, we did that. You're not out there taking credit as I when you talk about things in your day-to-day work. So in an interview, you do have to make that shift, which sometimes doesn't come naturally.
Yeah, great. So let's segue to advice that you both have for addressing some of the common interview questions. And I'd love to start with one that Tara put in here. How do you answer what is your biggest weakness without sounding too cliche?
Yeah, don't say I work too hard. I'm
I'm a
perfect.
perfectionist.
Yes. Yeah, they're onto that one. Yeah, that advice is probably still out there in books and articles, but they're onto that now. So that's not going to work out. This is a tough question, and I think everyone should be prepared for it. It has become a little bit less common. I think there's been a shift to some other things that sort of are similar topics, like asking about a failure or constructive feedback they've received, because I think people are prepared and they tend to gloss over this answer. The best way to answer it is to choose a weakness that is not going to raise red flags, something that's real for you. But I always say it's all about a spectrum. We can always be better. So it's not like I'm terrible at communication, but it's more, sometimes I can be a little bit too direct and a little bit of describing it in a way that shows it's just, this is something to work on. It's not a major red flag. And avoiding anything that's very central to your job. Don't say you hate math if you're an accountant. And then the key is adding on what I'm already doing to improve. So that shows you're someone who is driven to be the best, who takes initiative, who's self-aware, who's coachable, lots of other good things. So you can say, I've been working on this because I took this course and I've been, having some mentoring to help me with this area, so that it shows that you're already taking action.
I 100% agree. Like if it says in the job description that like flexibility, technology, and certain aspects are really important, you don't wave a flag and say, I'm a slow adopter. I get really attached to one thing and I can't move on. I can't learn a new technology. So we all have weaknesses, and I think using it as an opportunity to showcase something that is less important to them. And it can be an area of humor too, because we all need that humility. Confidence with humility goes a long way.
Well said, Rita. So well said.
Mm-hmm.
What about, because I know this can be especially difficult question for those that don't naturally communicate in a concise way. What about the broad, tell me about yourself question?
This is my favorite to talk about because people hate it so much. And I have this 3-part model. It's not the only way to do it, but I have this 3-part model that I tell that we talked about on Big Interview, and that I tell my coaching clients about, just to help organize your thoughts, because I do see it go awry so often. I think the most common thing is people start at the very beginning of their resume. They basically recite the resume with a lot of extraneous details. And by the time they get to the most recent, most relevant information, the interviewer is just checked out completely. So you do want to try to keep this in the 1 to 2 minute range. And if you've been working for a long time, that might not be easy. So this 3-part model, just to think about, and I think Carrie's going to share some links. We have some free articles about this on the Big Interview site. But so I always talk about part 1 is who I am professionally, why I'm qualified is part 2, and why I'm here is part 3. So I always recommend, if you can, starting with that who I am is sort of a big picture. So if you're mid-career or more senior career, that might be something like, I'm an experienced operations manager in such and such industry, working on XYZ, right? So something that's sort of a big picture credibility establishing of who you are professionally. And often that can very easily segue into part 2, which I talk about as sort of your highlight reel. So oftentimes that's maybe a little overview of the last few positions. I typically recommend starting with the most recent, because that's probably what is most relevant to the job you're interviewing for. And you can throw in some other things there if you have an award or if you have an interesting nonprofit experience that you've volunteered with, that sort of thing. But really kind of thinking about 4 or 5 kind of bullet points in that middle, kind of summarizing your most relevant qualifications. And then the why I'm here is super simple and again, optional, but I always like ending with a statement of interest in the role. And it can be general. It can just be really excited to be here. I think this would be a great fit for me. You could throw in a detail about why. They're definitely going to ask later, why are you interested in this role? And you'll have more time to expand. But I think it's nice to establish interest right out of the gate. And I also think it's helpful because sometimes people get off in the weeds when they're trying to do that little part and they start rambling. And so it's nice to have like a home base where you're like, oh, wow, I've been talking for a while. Let me just get into that part 3, wrap it up, and end in that sort of confident way instead of trailing off or doing the thing I see a lot, which is, yeah, so is there anything else that you want to know? Like, doesn't really convey confidence. So yeah, that's one way to approach it. I guess one thing to keep in mind is it's really tell me about yourself professionally. So yes, you could throw in a few details about your interests or your hobbies, but make sure that you're communicating your professional background in the way that puts you at full advantage. This is your chance. People hate this question. It's a huge opportunity. You can start the interview by positioning yourself the way you want them to see you, focusing on the things that are most relevant for this job, and really starting the interview strong. And if you have a good answer prepared for this, you don't have to be as nervous about, gosh, what am I going to say with the first question? So lots of advantages to spending at least just a little bit of time outlining an answer for this question.
Yeah.
I actually coach people, Pamela, to keep it to 2 minutes or less. And if they want more, you could end it with like, did you want more detail on any of those things to continue the conversation? But don't go on for 5 minutes. For me as a junior interviewer, I was using a filter. Can you do the job? Will you do the job? And is it a fit? The can you would usually come out in the resume and the skill set. The will you would usually come out from the references. What's their track record? Is it a fit is more the why I'm there. So they map closely to your format of a follow-up, but be mindful of your audience and why they're asking the question. Don't waste time on things that aren't important to them. If you could use your guardrails as can you, will you, and is it a fit to streamline that answer, that's a good place to start.
Great. Wonderful.
Yeah.
I love the idea of having a framework. That's so helpful.
Yeah. And I think this is one that really, one of the things I talk to people about is outlining your bullet points. So I don't think for most people, it's not that helpful to create a script. You don't want to be reciting something word for word. It's more stressful because you have to memorize and you don't sound authentic anyway. So I think, especially with difficult questions or questions where you have to try to keep it concise and it's going to be easy to kind of wander off into too much detail. Outlining your bullet points and having a framework like this to kind of organize those bullet points can be really helpful. I also think bullet points for tricky questions, if you're worried about answering why you left your last job or something else that's a little sensitive where you want to make sure you're not raising red flags. So there are some key questions where I think it really is beneficial to outline the bullet points and practice on that. Not necessarily every question if you're comfortable with other topics, but for this one, it can be really helpful.
Terrific. We have more questions coming in. I'm going to take as many as possible. Before we get to those, though, I want to talk salary negotiation because I suspect this is of top of mind for a lot of people and everyone welcomes advice on this topic. So Pamela, what advice do you have for negotiating salary and or other aspects of the total package? And have you seen changes in the approach now that more and more states and localities are requiring more transparency and actually require the salary range to be included in the job posting?
Yeah, it's made it a little bit more interesting. So two changes. One, that multiple states now are requiring companies to put a salary range in the job posting. Now, some companies get cute by putting like the range as 30,000 to 230,000 or something. And not at all. So you gotta watch out for that. That tells you something about, I don't know if this company is 100% upfront and honest here. But the other factor that comes into play more in certain states is they're not supposed to ask you what you're currently making. And that was a very common question, and it did lead to people being stuck in underpaid roles because the next salary was always based on the previous and the slight increase on the previous. And if you somehow accepted a role that was underpaid for whatever reason, then you kind of get stuck there. So the idea with the laws around that were to make sure people are being paid what they're worth in the market and not, have it stuck on a decision you made 10 years ago, right? So they should not be asking you, what are you making now? In some states, I guess it's still okay. There are ways to deflect that, whatever you can do to avoid bringing up that number of what you're making now, or even what you're looking to make. That's perfectly okay to ask. What are you looking for in terms of compensation? But if you can avoid that until later in the conversation, once you've established leverage, once they love you, right? So you don't want to, especially if you think you might be a little on the high side, you don't want to knock yourself out before they love you. So if you can, one of the things I suggest people do, if they can, is say something like, well, I'm really excited about this role, and I'm sure, it's a competitive salary, so I'm sure it'll be fine, or I'm looking for a competitive salary, whatever you can do to make it clear, look, I'm not cheap, I'm looking for what's fair, but I'm not going to name a number quite yet, if you can do it nicely. If you can't, deflect completely, giving a range so that you then still have room to negotiate within. The longer you wait, the more leverage you have. Like I said, they like you. It's probably down to fewer candidates. Maybe you're the finalist, and so they're going to be more apt to want to give you what you want. So those are a few of the things to keep in mind. I would also say one of my tips for negotiating is negotiate. Don't think you can negotiate. I mean, certainly don't negotiate if you're totally happy with the offer and it's more than you wanted. Don't do it just for the sake of doing it. But I think a lot of people shy away from negotiating, even attempting to negotiate. And I think it's important most companies are very open to you coming back and doing it in a respectful way, expressing appreciation for the offer that was given and excitement about the opportunity, and then saying, hey, based on my research, I was expecting maybe something more in this range. How do you feel about that? What can they do? They can say no. And then you can make a decision based on what they offer. Or you can then come back to them, as Carrie referred to, and say, okay, well, that's fine, but what other things can we negotiate? Maybe flexible hours, maybe there's some sort of bonuses or some sort of guarantee that we're going to renegotiate salary at the 6-month mark if I meet these milestones. There's a lot of things you can negotiate on to make it a better deal for you that are not strictly salary.
Excellent. So I'm hearing one of the keys is timing, and wherever possible, avoid being nailed to that specificity until much later in the process when you have more leverage, and make sure that you've done your homework and also know your rights. Because Kate said, I think it was Kate, that happened to her where she ended up getting stuck at a lower comp level because they based her pay based on her previous role versus value for that particular position. We have a question from Warda. What about promotion? Can we negotiate there? And what if during the process, they, HR, say others in that new role don't make as much as I'm making?
Yeah, I think you can. Certainly when you're talking about a promotion, you might have more information as an employee about what the salary bands are and what their ability to give you more is, and sort of evaluating whether the HR person is telling the truth versus trying to get you for less, right? So I think it is a business proposal in the end, right? So if they come back to you and say, well, this is what we're paying others, you can come back to them and have a few bullet points saying, well, based on my research, this is what I think is the right rate, and here's why. I have this experience. I have these proven accomplishments at the company. I know I'm going to hit the ground running. I don't need a learning curve. And so I think being able to make the business case for the higher salary to help you there. And yeah, no guarantees, but I would always try.
Well, historically, so many companies have promoted from within, and one of the reasons they do it is because it saves them money. That you're more likely to take a marginal increase versus if many people would leave the company to get that role and have a higher pay, and then they would have the onboarding costs too. So I think it's a mistake for companies not to offer internal candidates the promotional value that they would have to pay to an external candidate. So know what that value is.
Yeah. Excellent. Yeah. And being mindful of internal pay equity is also a reality. So balancing all of that. To the point you made, Pamela, it never hurts to ask.
Yeah. And I think those have been conditioned, and I wouldn't say only women, but I think certainly a lot of women have been conditioned maybe to shy away from negotiating, and certainly some men as well, just to feel like, well, if I'm worth it, they're going to give it to me. They're going to notice I do a good job. They should give me what I deserve. And fortunately, it's not always the case. So I think, yeah, going in prepared can help counter some of those cringe feelings of not wanting to have to ask for more money.
Right, like male, female, or other. If you have a new title, you have a negotiation.
Yes. Great point. Yeah. And I would just say, looking at it through the lens of someone who's making those selection decisions, providing someone does it in a very respectful way, meaning negotiation, and it's reasonable, even if they don't get what they want, what conveys to me is they're demonstrating their strength and their negotiation abilities, because many positions require that skill. There's various levels of negotiation that you need people to do in a role. And if they don't at all, it can be a bit of a concern. So it's a way to show your strength as well. So my goodness, we are nearing the end. Let's take a few more questions here before we wrap up. This one relates to the resume itself. I know we're focused more on how to really show up and do an exemplary job in the interviewing process. As it relates to the resume, let's say you've done a ton of work in really creating a top-notch resume. What advice do you have for tailoring that resume to a specific role? Lonnie's commenting on the fact that during a recent wave of interviewing we were somewhat surprised at how few candidates actually did that.
I don't think that you can manipulate your resume for every job interview, but if it's a big one and it's important, you may showcase different elements of it. But remember, your resume could get forwarded, so you don't want to make it so specific that it eliminates you for another possible role. So I think having the standard resume, and then if in that case, since it's an executive role, showcase in that history, showcase what maps to your priorities that you've asked for, Carrie. I'm curious, Matt, what do you think? Should they have a different resume for every job interview?
Maybe not for every job. I think probably where customization is most important is if people are considering a couple of different career paths, right? So if you're only interviewing for head of sales for this type of company, then you're probably going to use the same resume, maybe change a few words here and there to customize for the job description. But I've worked with a lot of early career folks, especially, who are considering a couple different, they have a very diverse background. They could go in a couple different ways from where they are now. And so they're looking at a couple different types of roles or a couple different industries. So I always recommend, if you can have a version of the resume tailored to those different types of opportunities, and you're not making things up or changing things, but it's just about what do you emphasize, where do you highlight things, and might you leave out in some cases if you have a lot of older experience that may not be relevant. So I think especially if you're looking at different paths, and then if you are applying online, unfortunately, a lot of companies are using these technologies to eliminate resumes and to highlight the ones that they think are a fit and put the others into the bin. So the digital bin, I guess. But So I think that can be helpful if you're applying online. Sometimes just looking at the job description, thinking about what are the keywords, what are the skills and competencies that seem to be emphasized on this job description? Are they in my resume? If they're not, could I add them in a way that's truthful? Change, sometimes phrasing is different, and you can put social media marketing instead of video marketing or whatever it is to make sure that it's matching to those keywords that'll make it more likely to get past the robots and actually be seen by a real human being who will have more context for what you're writing.
Harriet, I saw a question in chat from Brent about what to recommend to the female friends that might be struggling with certain conversations. And we were talking before this, and Pamela has a book, and I just want to be sure that book gets mentioned, because I think it probably would be ideal for Brent to recommend to his female friends. And by the way, Carrie mentioned some statistics early on about how many resumes are coming in for jobs. And what other research that we've seen is that a lot of men will step forward for a job that lists 20 or 40 competencies that might only have 5, whereas women tend to, not to stereotype all, but they might want to know that they have all of them. So to push women and let them know that it's okay to step forward and raise your hand for a role internally or externally if you don't have all the competencies, be ready to answer to those. And we also have a format that we recommend to practice for those behavioral and competency questions that I can ask Andrew to put in the chat. But more importantly, I wanted Pamela to be able to mention her book.
Thank you.
Yeah, for bringing that up.
That was very nice. Yeah, I just found out yesterday, so I just mentioned it to Carrie and Rita today that it's going to be coming out on November 13th. I wasn't sure how long it would be before it was out in stores, but one of the things I really wanted to spend time on, because I hadn't seen it in a lot of other books on interviewing, is this idea of how do you sell yourself a bit more while still being you, and applying that to the different types of questions and the different topics. And a lot of it does come down to, because I've had so many coaching clients who are introverts, many even on the spectrum, or just shy, modest, humble types, where it's difficult for them to naturally go in and just riffing on how great they are. And so I think probably if some of your female friends also struggle with that, there's some good tips in there to kind of get over some of that hesitation.
Excellent. Yeah. Again, thank you, Rita. And so timely. I think it's being published or going to be available November 13th. There is a link in chat, so be sure to grab that. And also, I want to highlight what Rita brought up. She has an excellent method. It's been around for a long time, and it's still very relevant for a reason. It's the STAR method, which is a great technique to use to effectively respond to behavioral and competency-based questions. Thank you so much. I know we could go on and on and on, and we've just scratched the surface. So it's great that you've offered some resources that folks can tap into. And I also want to thank our audience. Your engagement, your questions have just been terrific. To close us out, we are going to share with you the topic that we're going to be covering at our next live event, which is all around how to get the most out of one-on-one coaching to level up your own presentation and communication skills. And also, before you drop, if there are other topics that you would love to have us cover at future live events, please put them in chat. We welcome your feedback and engagement. And Rita and Pamela, this has just been terrific. Thank you for your time and your sage advice.
Thank you. It's been a lot of fun.
Yeah. Thank you, Carrie. Thanks for having us.